I wanted to talk a little tonight about what the effect is of sustained contact with the Absolute, how that might impact both our karma as well as our identity. And this content is from the book I'm writing now. There was a school of Buddhism, there still is, called Yogachara. Yogachara basically means the practice of yoga or something like that. As I mentioned, a lot of the practices the Buddha did and incorporated into Buddhism had their origins in the yogic tradition that preceded Hinduism and Buddhism. So one of the presentations of the Yogachara school is the 8 levels of consciousness. The first 5 have to do with the sense organs, so touch, taste, smell, sound, all of that. And then there's thought process is, I think, the 6th, as I recall. And the 7th has to do with the relationship between thought and prior experience, karma, memory. So it's kind of the working with our concepts and our life experience. And the 8th level is called the alaya vijnana, which means the storehouse consciousness. And the way this is understood is that we all carry this storehouse consciousness, and as we engage in various activities, as we engage in thinking, all of life, it creates these little seeds called biju, B-I-J-U. And the biju are kind of like little memory pods, let's say, and they get put into the alaya vijnana. And the alaya vijnana is what informs the rest of the levels of consciousness and informs our identity, our history, how we look at things. So it's fairly important. It's believed that when we do sustained, particularly retreat practice, that we can release, if not purify, some of these biju. One of the ways this shows up on retreat is through dreams. I wouldn't be surprised to hear that a lot of you are having very vivid dreams on the retreat. That's very common. And sometimes people will have dreams that are completely unrelated to their life. I once on a retreat had a woman who was in her 80s, a very lovely person who was having horrific dreams of war, of sword fighting and heads being cut off and just on every night. And it was deeply troubling to her. And I told her that my teacher, Paul Snyder, when I broached the subject to him, he said, that's the release of past life karma. So it has nothing to do with this lifetime. It has nothing to do with her having any murderous intent. But it's releasing these biju. And that's part of what's expected on retreat. And part of it also, as I mentioned, ends up influencing our identity. Because our identity is constructed through a lot of different ways, including our past history, our experiences. We make conclusions based on our life experience, how we're impacted, the ways we're hurt, the ways we have joy. All of that gets put into the alaya vijnana and ends up becoming a composition of who we are. As we spend time contacting and resting in the Absolute, it allows the biju to be purified. Because in the Absolute, we're not creating more karma. It's one of the only times that we don't. And it actually purifies and releases old karma, old patterns, old behaviors. One of the things that happens on these retreats when we're contacting the Absolute is that whatever is incongruent with the Absolute is going to be arising. So for some of you, you're having old, early life patterns show up. Memories, experiences, defenses, resistances can be unearthed as we go more deeply into the Absolute. So to understand, that's part of the process. And what we want to do when these arise is we want to let them be there. We don't want to suppress them. We don't want to disregard them. Even if they seem hopelessly outdated, a strategy you had when you were 5 that you wouldn't dream of today, it still is a part of your system. And so the strategy is to let those be here, to stay with the practice, and not necessarily do anything. Just like letting the stillness, the peacefulness of the Absolute be here with whatever content is going on in our experience. In the same way, we hold that perhaps childhood defense along with being with the peacefulness, and we let those interact however they're going to. And just by staying present and aware and non-reactive, or as non-reactive as we can be, we begin to purify those old memories, the old strategies and resistances. Because even though we're not relying upon those as a strategy, it's still influencing who we take ourselves to be, and it influences what strategies we use today. Because you know what happens if we get overwhelmed by a situation, we revert to very early defenses. You know, we pull ourselves away. It's like little children take the ball and go home. You know, well, you're not going to have me to be around anymore. You know, this is the real early childhood response. You know, that's the worst I can do is take me out of your life. So the main point is just to recognize this is part of the process. It's expected. This is the purification of mind that we're going through. It changes our view and ultimately identity, because our identity is composed of these memories, these patterns, also these bijou. And all of this is getting touched by the Absolute. And there's an opportunity to change, to do things differently. So it's being open to new possibilities. If you haven't, for example, if you have a reaction to some memory that comes up, if you find you have an anger reaction, or even a hatred reaction, but a strong, forceful reaction, let that be there. Feel what it's like to really have anger in your system. You don't need to act it out or show it to anybody, but fully feel it. And when you get to where that feels like there's some resolution, try to move to the moment before the anger or hatred arose. That's the important time. That's going to be the fear, that's going to be the unworthiness, that's going to be whatever triggers the anger as a response. And that's what we're really interested in. And then if we get in contact with, say, a sense of weakness or helplessness, stay with that. Let that be here. What's it like to fully feel helpless? Completely helpless. One of the ways we recognize it, we can feel an ice water in our veins, like my arms and legs. I can feel like ice water's running through it as I'm referring to this. So that makes it hard for me to lift my arms. So there's a kind of weakness that's built into this. So stay with it. Allow the peacefulness, allow the love of the Absolute to meet it. And just let them interact, and they will harmonize in their own particular way. And as I mentioned, all of this changes identity, because all of this is part of that elaborate math equation that makes up you. And when you begin changing numbers in that equation, you change the result. There's a koan in one of the koan collections. In formal koan study, like I've done, you work through the koan collections. You start with generally the koan mu, and that koan, I'll just tell you, it's a very simple one. There was a Chan master Joshu with one of his students, and it's understood in all of Buddhism that all beings have Buddha nature, the nature to be fully realized Buddhas. And I suspect the student was feeling some doubt about whether he or she was included in that. So they asked Master Joshu, there was a dog walking past, and said, "Does that dog have Buddha nature?" And of course the answer everyone should give is yes, yes it does. Master Joshu said no. He said wu, which means nothing or no or absence, which of course put the student into a tailspin. How can that be possible? This revered teacher is saying this dog does not have Buddha nature. And so that begins the koan. How is that a truism? What's it like to be with that mu that Joshu gave? And so that's the first koan in a collection called the Muman Kan, which translates as the gateless gate. The second koan is one called Hyakujo's Fox. And I'll just tell you the story of that koan. It's going to relate to what I'm talking about. That there was a master Hyakujo, and he noticed that whenever he would give talks, there would be this old man that would come and stand in the back of the room, the back of the temple, and then would leave as soon as the talk was over. And one day the Hyakujo and this man met each other outside, and Hyakujo asked him, why do you keep coming here? And the man said, well, I was once a monk here, a long time ago. I was the teacher here. And somebody asked me, does somebody who's deeply awakened have karma? And I said, no, they don't have karma. And because of that answer, I was reborn as a fox 500 lifetimes. And a fox in Asia is like we would refer to maybe a weasel in the West, something sneaky and underhanded, something like that. So really not a pleasant rebirth. And so the man said to Hyakujo, he said, if I ask you now, does an enlightened person, are they subject to karma? And Hyakujo said something like, karma can't be ignored by anyone. I'm paraphrasing, but that was the answer. And so, of course, the man had a great enlightenment experience as all the koans resolve. And just to finish the story, the man then said, if you go to the other side of the mountain in this collection of trees and rocks, you're going to find the dead body of a fox. And I'd ask you to give it a monk's burial. And so that's what they did. And Hyakujo told this story to his community about this interchange with the man. And what's interesting about this koan and the function of karma is it's also understood that karma is not created by the unconditioned. When the unconditioned is functioning, it doesn't create karma. So part of the man's answer was correct. The other part is we live in a conditioned world. We live in a world where there's birth, decay, and death to almost all phenomena, including our own bodies. So to say that we're not subject to karma is not right either. So just understanding there is karma, and there's also times like these practices where we're not accumulating karma, we're actually releasing karma. So that's just to say what we're doing is important work. It's powerful work. So staying with this and letting it affect you is really the way to practice. I wanted to also talk a little bit about what an awakening is. I've referenced it a few times, and I think just so we have a complete picture. For me, I recognize or look for 3 components in an awakening experience before I'll validate somebody's experience. There first needs to be a deep experience of absence of self. I talked about that last night. That's that sense that there's just not a me in the normal way. There's, the ways I check in and identify a me aren't there, they're absent. And so in the awakening, in the Kensho, this would be something that would be sustained. The person normally would be experiencing this for a period of time. There's also the deep experience of unity, of love. And it's an overwhelming experience of love that everything is love, including me. We can't be excluded from that. People will sometimes hold the perspective, yes, everything is love. And I might say, are you love? Well, no, I'm not, but everything is. Well, then everything is not if you're not. So it has to be a complete experience of that unity. And then finally, we need to recognize the absence of self and this magnificent unity, love, is truly who we are. It's our true identity. And that's what creates the spark for the Kensho. That's the awakening. That's what I am. That's what I am. I know with certainty that's what I am. So as we move through these talks and as we exchange or interact, I just want to have that out there so you know that's what I'm referring to when I talk about Kensho and different enlightenment experiences.